Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, welcome to Ideas Having Sex. Today I am joined by Marian Tupy and Gale Pooley, and today we are discussing their amazing book, Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Gale, Marian, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Can you first each say a little bit about your backgrounds and how you came to collaborate on this project?
If you want, I can start. I was born in communist Czechoslovakia. I lived for part of my life in South Africa. I was educated in Britain. I came to the United States in 2002 to work at the Cato Institute, originally on economic development in sub-Saharan Africa and Eastern Europe. And then in 2013, I started working on a humanprogress.org website, of which I'm a founder and editor. And then I realized midway through the teens that the two most important objections to modernity, to economic growth, to human flourishing were really climate change and then a concern over resources. And since I didn't want to really write about climate change, since everybody else was doing it, I thought I would write something about resources. And a paper came out in 2017 showing that adjusted for inflation, resources were getting cheaper. And at that point, Gale enters the picture.
Well, my backstory is not as exciting as Marian's. I was born and raised in Idaho. I studied economics and always had an interest there. And one day I came across this tweet about resources and population. And so I reached out to the author of that tweet and began this great friendship and research effort. And that person was Marian. And we both had this common interest in Julian Simon, his work on resources and population, and how it was so much contrary to the accepted wisdom, the Malthusian view, that as population increased, that the resources would become more scarce. And he'd found that the opposite was true. And we were looking at the original bet that Simon had with Paul Ehrlich. And we asked ourselves, would Simon still win this bet today? The bet was from 1980 to 1990. And so out of that effort, we produced this paper that analyzed 50 basic commodities from 1980 to 2018. And we discovered that for every 1% increase in population, the price of things, we actually made a little adjustment. We converted money prices to time prices, but the time prices would fall by 1%. So very consistent with Simon's theory and very, once again, contrary to Malthus and Ehrlich's theory. So after that, we wrote that paper. People expressed more interest in the framework. So we did more work and ultimately produced our book together. So that's what brings us here today with you, Chris.
And just to make it clear, it was Gale's insight, really. He improved the methodology dramatically by basically urging me to look at resource prices, not just from the standpoint of real prices, nominal prices adjusted by inflation, but looking at time prices. And really, that is one of the original contributions that we have made in this book.
The whole conversation on time prices is really interesting, and I want to get into that. But before we do, can we back up and can you say a little bit more about the relationship and rivalry between Paul Ehrlich and Julian Simon, who they are, and how this bet came about? It's a great dramatic narrative to set the stage for this whole story. And not just this story, but this whole tradition of cornucopian authors basically flouting received wisdom that the world is actually getting a lot better.
Sure. After the Second World War, there was a massive increase in the populations of especially what was then called third world countries. Today, we would be calling it developing world, especially in Asia and Africa. And a lot of people are freaking out. So, population of the world back in 1800 was 1 billion people. By 1900, it was like 1.3 billion people. But then you get to 3, 4, 5 billion people. And basically, Paul Ehrlich becomes very famous in the 1960s by saying, look, we can't go on like this. We cannot have that many people consuming more resources, eventually we are going to run out of resources, or alternatively, resources are going to become so expensive that are going to be prohibitively expensive, and therefore people are going to starve to death. Now, his own theory was based on a paper or a book by Thomas Malthus, a 18th century English preacher / economist, who argue that population always grows at a faster pace than abundance of resources. So then Paul Ehrlich, as I said, publishes an incredibly important and certainly very influential book called The Population Bomb in 1968. He predicts that by the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people are going to die because they're not going to have enough food, etc. He appears on Johnny Carson, the most popular show in the United States, and by default, also the most popular show in the world, over 20 times. Nobody was on Johnny Carson's show as many times as that. He became an international celebrity, and basically he was the Thanos of the 1970s. He was the one arguing in favor of population controls, even coercive measures, in order to bring down the population. And he was a biologist. He is a biologist at Stanford University. He's now 92 years old. And over in Maryland, there was an economist by the name of Julian Simon, both of them Jewish, both of them children of immigrants from Europe. But Simon took a different view. He looked at the numbers and realized that actually, in spite of population growth, or maybe even because of it, resources were becoming cheaper. And so he and Ehrlich finally had a bet, which started in October or September 1980 and lasted for 10 years. And it was basically a futures contract, $1,000 for 5 commodities: zinc, chrome, copper, what am I missing? Nickel. And the question was, what will happen in 10 years' time? So in 10 years' time, in 1990, the population of the world has increased by hundreds of millions of people. And yet all of these commodities, adjusted for inflation, became cheaper. And so Ehrlich lost the bet. But in spite of the fact that he lost the bet, this obsession with resources and population has never gone away. Now, there has been a significant shift within the economics discipline. Many fewer economists believe that we are going to run out of resources than before. However, the public opinion still very much believes that the more people you have, the smaller slice of the pizza you're going to get to eat.
Yeah, so it's this view that looks at the world in terms of physics rather than economics. I mean, I think one way to think about the confusion is that the world has a finite amount of material, of physical substance. So people think that means there's a finite amount of resources, of natural resources, but resources are an economic concept, not a concept in physics. I mean, a resource is only a resource if it's useful to people, and that can change and grow and expand over time.
Yeah, Chris, I think hit that right on the head with that concept. Physics is about atoms. Economics is about knowledge. It's knowledge that transforms atoms into resources. Atoms without knowledge really have no economic value at all. And so, in a sense, when Thanos says the universe or the earth is finite, he's correct. There are a finite number of atoms on the planet, but it's knowledge that transforms these atoms into resources. And there appears to be no upper bound on the amount of discoverable knowledge that's out there to us if we're free to pursue it and to test it. So resources are really knowledge. Therefore, we make the statement that resources really truly can be infinite, because our ability to discover this valuable new resource in knowledge really is a function of human beings. And that really goes back to Simon's theory that, why is it that populations increase and resources become more abundant? Well, it's because people discover new knowledge. The more people you have, the more probability, if they're free, that they have to discover this valuable new knowledge. So you can grow knowledge faster than you can grow population. And that's what the actual empirical evidence also supports. It's knowledge that's our key. And it's really this fundamental error we made in economics way back when by saying that only atoms could be resources. That's not true. We've got to move from thinking in atoms to thinking in knowledge. And that movement suddenly lets you look at the world in this whole new perspective about how we create resources for one another.
Every baby comes into the world not just with an empty stomach, but also with a brain and a pair of hands.
That's a great way of illustrating it. And I love that in illustrating this human tendency to be pessimistic about population growth and resource use, you referenced Thanos from the Avengers series, and you've referenced him a few times, and his plan to gain all the power in the universe so that he can snap his fingers and destroy half of life within it, thus restoring some kind of balance between population and resources. So this is a speculative question, but why do you suppose that his plan was to destroy half of life rather than to double the resources, which would amount to about the same thing? And what do you think, does that dramatize something real about different worldviews?
Well, I'll want Gale to opine, but Thanos is not alone. You know, the great primatologist Dame Jane Goodall, who is still with us, also pushing 90, was recently asked if she had a magic wand, what would be the one wish she would have? And she said she would cut population in half or maybe even reduce it to 500 million. It never occurred to her to use the magic wand in order to double the Earth's resources. It's actually, no, I think, and I want to know what Gale thinks about it, but I think the problem is that human beings simply do not think in terms of innovation. We have a static understanding of what goes on in the economy, in the production of resources. We think about a static amount of technology, static amount of effort that goes into exploring those energies. And we always underestimate the amount of new knowledge and the amount of new technology that can be discovered in order to make resources more abundant. So it's that static mindset. And it is understandable that we should have it, because remember that as a distinct species, we've been on Earth maybe for 300,000 years. And for most of that time, 99.8% of the time, technological improvements were incredibly slow. It could be thousands of years between the time that humans discovered one thing that improved their lifestyles until another thing came along that improved their lifestyles. I mean, the amount of time between, the rise of agriculture and the discovery of really effective plows was thousands of years. So technological development was very slow, and consequently, you would not be surprised that our brains are not really adjusted. Our evolution has not prepared us for massive and rapid growth in technological improvements.
Yeah, exactly. Clarification on Thanos. He wanted to destroy half the population, so he was in favor of 50% cut. Ehrlich recently said he wanted a 75% cut, but Jane Goodall, she wanted 17 out of 18. She wanted to go from 8 billion back to 500 million. That's a 94% cut. So she trumped them all. But, this idea that, look, if you've got this power and you want to use this power to reduce life somehow, it's like, how, kind of inverted is your thinking? This life goes forward with people discovering how to increase abundance, not reduce population. So we also consider this ideology of scarcity to be probably one of the most harmful and dangerous and deadly ideologies that humanity has ever experienced. It's really an ideology. It's not based on empirical evidence. And with respect to this kind of, we as human beings, we just kind of have this real short-term vision. It's almost like we live in the moment and we're thinking about things in the moment. We don't have this perspective of the past that we really need to develop in order to think about, relative change. What was life like really back in 100 years ago? Well, things used to be really expensive. I mean, the prices were cheap, but they were really expensive because wages were so much lower. It's that relative measure that time prices give us, where we're looking at the money price and dividing it by someone's hourly income, that really reveals to us how much time does it take you to earn the money to buy that thing today relative to what it was yesterday or 100 years ago. And so we have that to consider. I think the other thing that Marian kind of touches on is this idea that we have this bias toward negativity. When I drive by the gas station and I notice the price of gas went up from yesterday, it's like, wow, the gas is getting more expensive. But I don't seem to notice it when the price goes down. I mean, I don't really kind of think about it when the price goes down. It's only when it goes up that I really become kind of concerned about it. We have a bias toward kind of this negative, by things that are problems, because that bias has allowed us to survive. It's allowed us to survive. So we tend to be more in tune to things that are problems than things that are, good things.
Yeah, I mean, the understanding of economic history is actually very important. And that's sad. That's in some ways unfortunate, because very few people are interested in economic history. Very few people are interested in economics. Very few people are interested in history. And many fewer are interested in economic history. And once you understand that over the last 100 years, chicken for an average American worker has become 26 times cheaper relative to effort. In other words, one of the things that we have discovered is that for the same amount of time that a blue-collar worker had to work 100 years ago to buy one chicken, now you can get 26. So that gives you a sense of just how expensive things were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful that there's almost a whole literature that's been birthed by all these great authors, and Superabundance is now part of this literature, but Matt Ridley's book and Ideas Having Sex, my podcast title, is shamelessly poached from his phrase. Steve Pinker, Deirdre McCloskey, all these great authors who have documented huge improvements in human welfare. I don't know, is it becoming more well known? I feel like if you ask average people point blank, they would probably acknowledge a lot of progress, but it doesn't seem to penetrate the general idea that things are horrible and getting worse, or that we're just around the corner from something terrible.
I wish you were right, and I hope that we can make a difference on the margin. But, you very often, I mean, we have plenty of these opinion polls asking people, do you think that things are more expensive today than they were yesterday, or 50 years ago, et cetera? People have this notion that, early 1970s or even 1950s were a much better time to be alive from a cost standpoint. That was always the case on the left, sort of looking at the early 1970s as the sort of golden period. And now for the right, it seems to be the 1950s, like the golden period when, one man could, supply everything for the household, wife didn't have to go to work. Yeah, but their standards of living were much higher than were much lower than what we are used to today. So a lot of people have a very skewed notion about what life was like in the past.
Hey everybody, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody so much for listening to my show. This has really been a dream come true for me, to be able to speak with scholars that I admire and read books every week that I'm always excited to read. This is still a small show, still a new show, still growing, and I appreciate everyone listening so much. If you want to help me grow my show, the simplest thing you can do is to write a review, just a short review, a sentence or two, on Apple Podcasts, or just recommend it to a friend. So I'm just reaching out to you to beg you humbly on my knees to please do that. I'm going to try not to bug you too much about it, but here I am bugging you. Anyway, back to the show. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the concept of time prices? What are their strengths compared to other measures, and maybe illustrate something you just did with chicken, but like something more broad about how time prices show the improvements in living?
So let's do just a quick kind of foundation. Is there are money prices and there are time prices. It's based on this idea that we buy things with money, but we really pay for them with our time. So how much time does it take you to earn the money to buy that thing? So money prices are expressed in dollars and cents. Time prices are expressed in hours and minutes. So the first thing we do is we convert everything to a time price. What was the money price and what was average hourly income? And there's lots of good series on what average hourly income was, both for unskilled workers, for blue-collar workers, for average workers. There's GDP per capita per hour. So there's lots of ways we can get that denominator to calculate a time price. And then the next step is, let's look at the time price over time. What did it cost you last year in terms of your time, and what did it cost you this year? So for example, if last year you were earning $20 an hour and a pizza cost $20, it means that pizza cost you 1 hour or 60 minutes. Well, if the pizza price had gone up to $21 an hour, but your income had gone up to $24 an hour, that ratio now is 0.875 of an hour, or about 52 minutes. So you've saved about 52 minutes. And what that really tells you is if you had spent the same amount of time working, the same hour working, you would get about 14% more pizza. So you're getting 14% more for the same amount of time. So that's the first kind of thing that we think about. So move everything from money to time. That's another mistake that I think we made in economics, is we tried to measure things in money, and we should have been measuring things in time. Of the 7 standard units that we use in science, 6 of those 7 are based on time. So if we want to be a science, we need to use time to measure things. But there are a number of other reasons that time prices yield what we think a much better view of what's happening. When innovation occurs, it shows up both in money prices and hourly income. You can have an innovation happen and it makes everybody's income increase. That effectively makes the time price go down. So it captures innovation better than just money prices. Second thing it does is you can transcend all of this problem that we have with trying to calculate CPI and all of these adjustments that people are trying to make. And we have disputes and contention over, well, what was the CPI? Is it 3.2? Is it 4.7? What is that? You transcend all of that because you can go right to the price back in time and look at the wage back in time and calculate a time price. And you can look at any product with any currency in any location and calculate the time price. You can go to Paris in 1850, figure out what a loaf of bread cost in terms of its time, and you can compare that to what a loaf of bread costs in New York today. So it lets you avoid all this contention with trying to make this kind of subjective adjustment with CPI.
Basically you don't have to worry about inflation when you're using time prices.
You can ignore all of this monetary inflation and just look at time. The other advantage of time is you can't counterfeit it and you can't inflate it. It's a constant. It's a continuous constant that we have. So it gives you this, we call time prices really the true measure or the true price. You have nominal prices, you have real prices that are theoretically adjusted for inflation. And then you have time prices, and time prices, once again, we believe are really the true price because it reflects this thing in science, which is this standard unit. Everybody gets 24 hours a day. We all have this sense of what an hour is. We have this equality of time that also is a way to measure between people's lives. What's your life like versus someone else or someone back in time? How much time do you have to devote to things? So it just, once again, it's an overall better way to measure what our standards of living are, how much abundance we are enjoying relative to what life was like yesterday.
Are there any methodological concerns when using time prices? You've talked about some of the advantages. Are there any downsides to this measure?
So time prices the book has been out for, a couple of years now, and nobody really attacked the basic methodology. I think the methodology is solid. The issue here is that you can only use time prices in order to compare like with like. It is easy to compare a loaf of bread from 100 years ago to a loaf of bread now, or a pound of beef, or a bag of oranges, or a bag of potatoes, or whatever. But when it comes to things which are changing in quality, especially very rapidly, then time prices have the same shortcoming as real prices or inflation-adjusted prices or CPI or anything else, which is, for example, it's very difficult to compare time price of an early iPhone 1 to iPhone 15, because iPhone 15 is a completely different beast.
Much less a rotary phone from the 80s.
Yeah. And so, but that being said, time prices are still very useful because, a lot of us still deal with, the most important thing we deal with is stuff like food, for example, and other resources such as, nickel, copper, iron, etc. Nobody can eat those, but they go into the production processes that make everything else. And so it has a lot of strengths, but it is not a useful universal measure because there is, for things that are, as I said, technologically changing. But then again, nobody knows what the real improvement is between iPhone 1 and iPhone 15 once you account for all the apps and so forth.
I do try to make a calculation. I asked my students, you got an iPhone 15 today, how many iPhone 1s would I have to give you for your iPhone 15? I haven't been able to get one student to say, you give me 1,000 or 1,000,000. It's like, no, that iPhone 1 is worthless compared to my iPhone 15. So from that respect, we could say, look, the iPhone 15 is infinitely better than the iPhone 1 based on what people's preferences are in terms of trading. How many units of this would you trade for units of that?
And you guys give an interesting example in the book where you talk about the differences in improvements in automobiles, and you compare an old Ford, and you say, you can't really compare this old Ford from whatever it was, the 60s or something, to a new car that has just enormously better features and features that didn't even exist back then. So you found some comparable car in India, I think it was, that is by modern standards, a very bad car, but it's comparable to a 1970s era Ford or something, and use that to demonstrate the improvements with time prices.
Yeah.
That was really clever. I had one question about the methodology of time prices, and I don't know if there's any way around this, but it actually goes in your favor. It's a way, it seems to me, that time prices might actually understate the improvements over time. Like if it took me an hour to get something and it took my grandfather 5 hours to get the same thing, he might have had to work 5 times as long, but it's also pretty likely that he was working much harder during those 5 hours or at a less pleasant job. So, is the disutility of particular types of labor accounted for at all? But even if it's not, it seems to me that actually is a point in favor of your case, or it understates the improvement.
Yeah, I always ask people, your grandpa used to try to count his fingers when he left to work in the morning, then he counted when he come home at night. And do you worry about that today? It's like, no, we don't worry about that because we're in these climate controlled places. Even if you are in a trade doing electrical or plumbing work, it's still so much safer and more pleasant than, our parents and grandparents had to deal with. So you're exactly right. Not only does it take us less time, but the time we have to devote to earning the money is much more pleasant than it was.
And that's an assumption I'm making. Maybe I'm wrong in some respects. I mean, people romanticize the past, but that seems obvious to me. But I don't know. I'm sure someone could do something.
No, I think there's something to it. The closest we can come to replicating or adjusting for that improvement is really by looking at unskilled laborers in the United States. So we have data going back to the late 18th century for unskilled laborers, and we do a calculation for, what sort of living standard could an unskilled laborer afford in 1850 compared to 2018. An unskilled laborer, that would be, let's say, a janitor, somebody just cleaning floors. And that gives us a sense of, but the relationship holds, whether you're looking at unskilled laborers or blue-collar workers or upskilling workers, the relationship holds. Most things in life are becoming superabundant, not just abundant, but superabundant. They are increasing at a faster rate than population growth.
The other thing that we tried to do is most people do not stay in those categories. We've got these categories of laborers. And it's like, well, unskilled workers in 1980, they earned this much, and unskilled workers today are earning that much. Well, most of those people that were unskilled in 1980 are no longer in that category. They are upskilling. We call it upskilling workers. They're moving up this category. So if you look at, instead of just comparing groups of people, compare individuals, because individuals are not staying in those groups. They're moving generally out of those groups higher. So that upskilling factor indicates an even greater abundance that people are enjoying, because as they acquire more human capital, they're earning more per hour, and that allows them to have much more abundance than an unskilled worker 40 years ago.
I'm guessing it's a lot easier to compare a category of worker over time than individual workers over time, because you get people dropping out and it's hard to do longitudinal studies with large numbers of people. But studies like that have been done and they show just what you're saying, right?
Yeah. If you talk to most people, I mean, how many people are still unskilled workers that had their first job in 1980?
Anecdotally, it's obvious.
Yeah, it's obvious. And then when you look at people that are moving up into those categories, it's like that is the natural, normal trend, is you're going to move up in that category. And if you just take a look at moving from just unskilled to blue collar, that's kind of the next level. You're not management, you're just blue collar. Just that jump is a significant jump. And that difference today is about double. You're going to make twice as much moving from unskilled to become a blue collar worker. And if you can move higher than that, get a college degree and move into some of these other professions, it's going to be even higher than that. I don't know if you remember your first job, but I remember my first job in 1980, and I'm making like $3.50 an hour. And,
Yeah, one of the things I'm very proud of is that from the beginning, when it comes to the United States, we decided to use only unskilled and blue collar workers, because, a typical rejoinder is, oh, well, everything is skewed by the rich, well, no need for skewing here. We are hiding nothing. We are looking at blue collar workers, unskilled laborers. Nothing is, we don't need to make adjustments for inequality. So in that sense, the work is solid. And as I said, the book has been out for 2 years. Nobody has found a methodological mistake, and nobody has attacked us on the basis of inequality.
How old is the concept of time prices? I think you guys have advanced it, but it's not original to you, correct? Nordhaus was doing something with this in the early 2000s.
Well, if you want, you can go back all the way to Adam Smith, who was talking about what is it? Whatever we buy with money, we buy with labor, which is just another way of saying time. Don Boudreau has done some work on this. Steve Horwitz, the late Steve Horwitz, has used it. The guys at, what is it?
Richard Alm and Cox.
Where are they? They are at in Dallas, right?
Yeah, Dallas Fed. Yeah, Cox. Yeah. SMU.
Yeah, they've done that. So it's been around. I think that what we bring to the table is one reason why the book is so long is that everything is upfront. You have the methodology staring you in the face. You can do these calculations yourself. Everything has been explained. The advantages and the shortcomings have been explained. And in that sense, providing the methodology and doing an exhaustive look at the resources is really what we brought to the table that nobody else has done on that scale.
So part of what our challenge was is we started to apply this methodology. We first started with these basic commodities that Simon and Ehrlich had this bet over. And then we expanded and said, one of the criticisms of the Simon Ehrlich bet is that it only covered these 5 metals. So we said, well, let's look at energy. So we looked at crude oil and coal and natural gas. Let's look at food. So we look at all these food items. Fortunately, we found a couple of really good sources for all of these nominal prices. So World Bank tracks these nominal prices monthly. So we were able to rely on them for all of these money prices back, they keep track of it clear back to the 1960s. The data starts to thin out before 1980. So we had really good money price data. And then it was, okay, after a while, we just start seeing these numbers that our challenge then began to be, let's try to find something that's become more scarce. We're finding all the stuff that's become more abundant. Can we find anything that's become more scarce? And we were able to identify a couple of industries where time prices are increasing. But what we also noted is those industries are characterized by government's involvement either as subsidizing demand or restricting supply. There was something involved where the market really wasn't working. It was being influenced. For example, healthcare and higher education. Those 2 industries, we do observe an increase in the time price over time, but it's due in large part to this involvement in government on the supply and or the demand side.
I was going to say, do you think that's more about restriction of supply or more about inflation of demand or both?
Well, you think about education, for example. It's like
both are happening.
We're going to give these students these loans to increase demand, and we're also going to restrict supply by imposing accreditation and so forth on that industry. Same is true in medicine. We're going to give people money to go buy medical care, but we're also going to restrict supply with limiting licensing and so forth. So it's really, there's really not a market in the sense that you've got a buyer and a seller. You've got a third party that's entering into that equation that is influencing both of those parties. And the result is a different price, a price that's much higher than we think would be true without government involvement. We took healthcare and we look at the healthcare prices and we said, can we find something that's in the medical field that doesn't have this? And we looked at plastic surgery, cosmetic procedures. And, you really don't have insurance involved there. You don't have government. You don't have the kinds of things that you have with normal surgery. And what we discovered there, same thing. Prices tend to be going down. Abundance is increasing 3 to 4% every year in that area. We looked at things like LASIK surgery, contact lenses, those other kinds of things that are elective that don't have government involvement. And they're all indicating an increase in abundance, which means it's costing you less and less time to buy those products and services than they have in the past.
You also mentioned another important one is housing, and that even though in general housing is getting more abundant, there are some narrow areas in very high demand cities where maybe it's not the case, like in the San Francisco Bay Area and things like that, for exactly the reason you say, huge restrictions on supply.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to buy a house, you can buy a really good house, a really nice house in West Virginia today for under, $100,000. The issue is the price to income ratio that you have. California, their prices are are, you say, wow, it's a $600,000 house, but it's 6 times or 8 times what average income is there. So you can find these housing prices that are much cheaper in terms of people's incomes, but, do you want to go move there and live there?
Yeah. But the bottom line is that when you look at an average price of an American house, it is about 9 or 10% cheaper than what it would have been 30 years ago. But obviously, there is an issue here with high demand areas. Clearly, I mean, here I live in Washington, D.C., regrettably, and you cannot build up. You can build up across the river, across Potomac, in Roslyn and on the Virginia side, but not in Washington, D.C. So our prices are very high. Similarly, in Virginia, if you want to open a new hospital, you need to have a certificate of need. What is a certificate of need? You need to basically have all the other hospitals in the area sign a letter saying that it's okay for you to build a new hospital in Virginia. Now, how on earth are you going to do that? Even if you're a billionaire who just wants to do a good thing and build a new hospital, you have to have all of your competitors basically say, yes, it's okay for this person and for this new hospital to be created. So American economy is a marvel in many ways. The things that are deregulated, the things where the market is allowed to function is performing wonderfully. But we mustn't underestimate the amount of monopolization, the amount of restriction, the amount of licensure that goes on in the American economy. Our economy could be growing much faster if we subjected other parts of the economy to the same level of competition that, for example, toys and furniture and white goods are subjected to.
Another interesting restriction on medical care is not just the hospital restrictions, but it's illegal in a variety of ways for ordinary corporations to have like house doctors on call. Denny's can't just have like a Denny's doctor or something on call to help with their employees or something. You don't see companies doing this because it's not allowed.
And since we are bitching, here in Washington, D.C., people have been complaining about the price of childcare for a very long time. So what did our infinitely smart government do? They passed a law last year saying that if you want to take care of children, you now have to have a bachelor's of arts degree, which is only going to drive up the prices of childcare. So all of these things are happening, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for purely rent-seeking reasons. But the bottom line is that there's a lot of fat that could be cut. There's a lot of efficiencies that could be gained by simply liberating different parts of the American economy to serve the American public.
If you define resources as knowledge, it really is what is limiting the growth of knowledge, the discovery and growth of knowledge. And it really comes down to, do we have a bureaucratic state that is limiting people from discovering, creating, and then sharing that knowledge in markets? And it really is this battle between a bureaucratic mindset and an entrepreneurial mindset. It's entrepreneurs that want to create value versus bureaucrats that are attempting to really maintain this status quo that allows current leaders in those industries to maintain their status by preventing this new knowledge discovery.
So many people will hear the optimistic claims like the ones that you make in this book and the ones made by people like Matt Ridley and Steven Pinker, and they might nod along as you explain it and assent to a lot of them. Yes, disease is decreasing, COVID notwithstanding, lifespan is increasing, wealth is increasing, education, literacy is increasing. But two major exceptions, I put in scare quotes, that a lot of people might bring up are that, yes, but the environment and equality are getting notably worse. I'm not claiming that, but what's your reaction to those objections?
Inequality argument, that's over. People shouldn't pay any attention to it. There is a book that completely debunks it. It's a book by Phil Graham and John Early, and the third author, whose name I forget, called The Myth of the American Inequality. And here is the problem. Our government, in a truly venal fashion, does not count taxation and transfers when calculating inequality in America. Inequality in America, by government's own statistics, is based on market income. In other words, that notional figure that your employer tells you that you are worth. So let's say that your employer hires you at $100,000. That's your market income. But you never see $100,000 because a third of that is going to go into taxes. And some of that money is going to be redistributed to the people at the bottom of the income ladder. Once you account for taxes and redistribution, taxes from the rich and redistribution to the poor, income inequality between the quartiles decreases from 16 to 1 to 4 to 1. There has been no increase in inequality in the United States in the last 40 years, maybe even longer.
Another thing that we did is we actually do a measure of time inequality, not income inequality, but time inequality. So we begin with this recognition that we all have 24 hours in a day. So the question is, how do you get to spend your 24 hours, and how does Elon Musk get to spend his 24 hours? You know, as we start to see these abundances occur in all these other kind of basic food products, for example, go back to 1960 and somebody in India, they were spending basically 8 hours a day working to just earn the money to buy the food to sustain them for that day. Well, the price of wheat and corn and rice have all fallen by around 90% in that last, since 1960. So instead of spending 8 hours a day, they're spending less than an hour a day. That means they have 7 hours now of time that they could pursue other things, education, travel, leisure, sleeping. So it's that time inequality that really should be what's really important to us. And that is much more compressed than this income equality, even after you adjust for tax subsidies and taxes. So once again, we think time is a better way to measure than money when it comes to inequality.
And this isn't even to go ahead.
No, it's funny. All the people who complain about, inequality and so forth, and they get annoyed when they go to any European city and there are tens of thousands of Chinese tourists snapping pictures and everything. Well, why are the Chinese traveling to Europe, to Florence and Venice and Rome? It's because now they have the money to spend on leisure and travel and doing other things rather than eking out a living and eating dirt like they did when Mao was in charge.
The point you just raised, Marian, was about American inequality, and arguably there's a stronger case to be made about within country inequality in Western societies, maybe in America in particular, but that's not even very strong. But global inequality has unambiguously been falling.
Absolutely. So for the longest time, I used to make an argument that now turns out to be wrong, at least probably wrong, which is that in order to generate a lot of economic growth at home, you have to increase inequality. But then, so as domestic inequality increases within the market system, you're also generating much more growth for your country, and therefore international inequality will fall. But looking at the work of people like Graham and Early, it seems to be that even domestic inequality is really not increasing. We are not counting the tremendous amount of taxation and redistribution that goes on. I mean, it's pointless to say that, Elon Musk is worth $200 billion because he's never going to see that money. If he sold all of his stock, his 150 billion or his 200 billion is going to very quickly become 150 billion or less. And that goes for people right across the income spectrum.
Even if he was to cash out, what would he do with his money? What would he really do with his money? I mean, I look at his life and I think, he's kind of wearing the same clothes I'm wearing. He has the same pair of glasses. He
doesn't have a better phone.
He doesn't have an iPhone 25. He's got an iPhone 15, same kind of technology that I'm using. And it's true that he gets to fly in private jets and so forth, but the food that he eats, the experiences that he has, the places that he can go on this planet, the cruises that he can go on, all these things that we consume, they're pretty well accessible to most people on the planet today. If you are moving in an economy where you're becoming more and more productive, these things are now available to you with much, much less time than they used to require.
I think Don Boudreaux made this point. He's an economics professor at GMU in Virginia. He made the point that, 100 years ago, you could tell a rich person from a poor person just walking down the street by the clothes they wore. You cannot make that point now. That it's rich and poor are indistinguishable in terms of how they dress. In fact, rich people are now dressing worse than others by design. When it comes to food, maybe they can have private chef, but the increase in quality is marginal. If they fly on a business jet, yes, it is more comfortable, but maybe they can shave off an hour between Los Angeles and Sydney, maybe 2 than the rest of us. The point is that the world is much more egalitarian than it ever was. And part of the reason why we spent so much time in chapter 8 showing what life was like in pre-industrial Europe, for which we have the best data, is to explain people just how bifurcated societies were. There really was a tiny sliver of people, the kings and queens, the nobility, the high clergy, who had a decent standard of living unless you got sick. But 90% of people were the peasants covered in dirt digging for potatoes, and that's no longer the case.
Well, one of our friends makes this point. He goes, it used to be that, rich people were fat. And today it's like, no, poor people are fat. Well, how did we do that flip? How did nutrition suddenly become this thing that poor no longer had to worry about being hungry? And so that's a real simple observation there that says something changed dramatically.
By the way, nothing against potatoes, given that Gale is from Idaho.
So you started, Marian, at the beginning of this interview mentioning getting into this topic because it seemed that some of the big objections to this view of human progress were resource use, and you also mentioned climate change. So you want to say something about the environment and maybe climate change as another large objection that people are going to make to the view that humanity is on a steady march of progress?
Sure. Well, as I said, I didn't want to get into that because there are many other people, many of them smarter and better writers than I am, working on this issue. So, I thought our comparative advantage would be in resources. But it is difficult to think of any indicator of environmental quality which is not improving. I repeat, it's difficult to think of any environmental quality indicator which is not improving in rich countries, from the air we breathe to the cleanliness of our rivers, to the way that we dispose of our refuse, to the protection of animals, to protection of wildlife, to the amount of land that we are sparing for nature as we are becoming more and more urbanized. And that is why the environmentalists are not talking about those issues. When I was a kid, the environmentalist mascot was a whale. Well, they no longer have that because we have plenty of those. Then there was the panda bear. We no longer have that because there are plenty of pandas. Then it was the polar bear. Polar bear numbers are exploding. So environmentalists don't talk about these things because if they did, they would have to acknowledge what is clear from the data from the Yale Environmental Protection Database, which is that there is a very high correlation between high income and better environment. The richer the countries are, the better the environment they have. And so the last leg on which they can stand is the question of climate change, specifically CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. And I accept the anthropogenic contribution of CO2 into the atmosphere. I accept that the world is warming. What I do not accept is that we are facing an existential crisis. We know that we are not facing an existential crisis because fewer and fewer people every year are dying due to extreme weather. Whether you are talking about heat waves, whether you're talking about floods, or whether you're talking about mudslides or forest fires or even earthquakes, the fact is that many fewer people are dying every year than they used to in the past. As our civilization is making our dwellings sturdier, as we have satellites which warn us against approaching hurricanes, there is no existential crisis in that sense. So we have time, we have brains to take care of CO2 in the future through, for example, technological change. I would like to say one thing which I feel very passionate about. The greatest enemies of environmentalism are the environmentalists. Had they not shut down the progress of nuclear power in the 1970s, the Western world would be run now by fission power, and we wouldn't be talking about CO2 at all. Global warming and CO2 would not be an issue because we would be producing plentiful, reliable, and cheap energy out of nuclear power rather than fossil fuels. The problem that we are facing today with regard to higher CO2 emissions, with regard to global warming, has been created by the environmentalists.
I just say amen to that, and just add another note to the effect that we have seen this movement away from looking at the empirical evidence, the number counts, the pollution levels. When those have all improved, No longer is the discussion about this empirical evidence. It's moved to these hypothetical models. It's models that are projecting these events out into the future. And we can go clear back to Malthus. And his analysis was a model, a hypothetical model that he put on the table. If he had taken a hard look at what was happening to the prices, the time prices of commodities in England for the prior 100 years, he would have seen, look, yes, our population is growing, but our abundance at a personal level is also increasing. So it's always a question. You've got this hypothetical model. What does the data say? What is the evidence that you have to support this? And many people today do not want these models to be questions. It's, no, our model has projected this. Therefore, we must do something today to avoid this hypothetical event out into the future. So once again, I think you want to do science, you've got to have a theory that allows you to connect facts together, but it fundamentally has to be based on these facts and observations. It can't entirely rely on these hypothetical models only.
What do you guys think is the strongest objection to the cornucopian view of human progress?
There is none in terms of resources. I have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with David Deutsch, the Oxford University physicist from last year. People can look it up. We go through all the different scenarios of how humanity could run up against some sort of a hard limit on the production of resources. There is none. There is a hypothetical problem discussed within the climate movement, which is that at some point the temperature of the world could rise to such extent that you are going to have tipping points and self-reinforcing sort of vicious cycle of destruction that could basically destroy our ability to survive on a planet. There's a huge literature on this. In the book Superabundance, we reference a meta-study of 4,000 different studies on these tipping points. There is a lot of disagreement among scientists whether tipping points can even be measured, whether they in fact exist, let alone how serious a problem this is. So yes, there is a hypothesis that you could have this sort of vicious cycle of tipping points in atmosphere and oceans and so forth falling and then reinforcing each other until the world blows up. But if you want to go by that kind of hypothesis that isn't even methodologically sound, then I would propose that you are the kind of person who would latch on just about any apocalyptic scenario about the future.
So there's another argument that says, if you have this cornucopian world where you have all this abundance, then people become really relaxed and they stop working, they stop innovating. And so your innovation pattern stops and you become so abundant that you also stop having children. Elon Musk says there's not enough people. And so civilization kind of implodes because of too much abundance. So we've heard that argument as well. And I think the issue there is going to have to be something with respect to, look, this abundance has to be part of our culture, that we continue to pursue this value that we place on people that are these innovators that are advancing our standards of living. So yes, we are going to enjoy this abundance, but it gives us the opportunity to even be more innovative because we have that fundamental resource available to us, which is more time.
I would say that is certainly a concern I have. People who don't follow me on Twitter can check out some of the tweets I put out today. There seems to be a sort of U-shaped curve in terms of how many babies people have, which is to say that poor people have babies above replacement rate. People of the middle income have babies below replacement rate, but very rich people have babies above replacement rate. And that's something I didn't know. That's a new piece of information to me. And it's not just true of the United States, it's also true internationally, which means that if we can get our GDP growth up, if we can make a lot more people even better off than they are, that they might want to have more babies than is currently being the case. So that's what gives me hope, but it is certainly a concern that Gale has raised.
It's kind of like we have a Kuznets curve with population.
More children for the very poor,
we go through this
less
period
for middle income, and then higher
we
for
go
very
through
high
this
income.
period where we don't have children because we're trying to grow the economy, and once it reaches a certain level, then children become a much more value trade-off.
And this is another area, it seems like, where innovation could change the whole dynamic at some point. I mean, people are very motivated to have kids. It's a biological urge, and it's a huge goal for most people, but it's also costly and difficult for some people. And technology has been and will probably continue to make the difficult parts of child raising less difficult. And I'm sure.
I mean, if you want to be really utopian about this, and a lot of my conservative friends have a problem with this, but I mean, it is possible. It will be possible in not too distant future to have babies basically being born within artificial wombs, so that it doesn't have to interrupt her career doing that. I mean, we already have a kind of artificial womb. It's called an incubator. That just means taking the incubator back in time, really, of the infant. But then, of course, the question of bringing up the child and the accompanying costs. Can we envisage 50 years in the future, every household having an electronic nanny that is going to take care of the child? Of course we can. The combination of robotics and AI means that this should be possible. So once again, in the immortal words of Matt Damon stuck on Mars, I will have to science the shit out of this.
In this book, you guys put forward your own explanation for human progress, for how it is that humanity broke free of tens of thousands of years of stagnation. Can you summarize your view, your causal view of how that happened, how it can happen for currently poor countries, and where you maybe differ or complement other thinkers who've opined on this?
We certainly think that it is the growth of freedom broadly understood. The freedom to think, the freedom to speak, the freedom to publish, also the freedom to participate in the market without too much bureaucratic oversight. It's very difficult to think about, say, Europe, where all of this starts in 1500s, where people are not free to think and to publish because you have very strong controls on what was allowed to be said and what was allowed to be discussed. And of course, the entire economy was heavily dominated by government-sponsored monopolies, be it guilds or different import-export monopolies enforced by the crown. The beautiful thing that happens in 18th century Europe, but it probably starts even sooner, is that all of these blockages, all of this power of the status quo forces begins to break down. Now, the reasons for that are, in our book, is the competitive international system that emerges in Europe. Europe, unlike other centers of civilization, such as China and India, doesn't have an internal empire. You have competing states that basically realize that in order to survive as an independent country, we have to allow for a lot of innovation at home in order to increase our economic output, in order to increase our military strength. And consequently, what you have is liberalization by the political elites out of self-interest, out of their desire to survive. That is our explanation for it.
You know, it's consistent with Deirdre McCloskey's arguments about, Holland really being the Netherlands really being this source. And you look at that place, and that was very decentralized power. You had this competition between governments. You had this competition between religion. It's this competition that really serves innovation. The freedom to innovate has to be tied with this freedom to compete. You're competing to innovate.
That's correct.
There are you guys reference in the book, numerous pessimistic apocalyptic movies and stories, I'll end on a light note, that dramatize apocalypse and the end of the world. Do either of you have any recommendations for movies or stories that do the opposite, that dramatize an optimistic cornucopian view of the world?
I say go back and watch Star Trek on TV back in the 60s.
Star Trek occurred to me.
I think it was so popular because it had this positive vision of the future. It was, it's a positive vision. It wasn't, we had an apocalypse on Earth and we all escaped from Earth and we're out there trying to survive. It's like, no, we're out there pursuing new knowledge. We're out there discovering and pursuing new knowledge. We're not trying to escape some, dystopian world that was left here on Earth.
And I guess my recommendation would be Expanse. It's called Expanse, the TV show. I mean, it is drama, there's a lot of fights and so on, but it is about a future of humanity that has conquered the galaxy. People are living on different planets. People have all sorts of amazing technologies. Especially the first and the second season were very good. I think it goes for a little too long. It becomes much less interesting later on. But for an optimistic view of the future where humans have tackled most of the problems that we've been discussing today, that would be one of them.
These are all science fiction recommendations, but I'm going to throw out 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think it's mostly remembered for the dark, negative conflict with the supercomputer HAL, but ultimately it has a super optimistic ending and view of humanity rising to new evolutionary heights.
Humans beat HAL at the end.
They do win.
Right?
Can either of you recommend a book for something that you think would complement Superabundance especially well?
On the broad subject of human progress, I still think that Matt Ridley's Rational Optimist and Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now are really already, well, Matt's is a classic because it's been out for longer, but Steven's deserves that too. And Jim Pitokakis from American Enterprise Institute has a new book out, The Conservative Futurist, which is also very good. And of course, Julian Simon is always worth reading simply because he got to it first. His Ultimate Resource 2 is really a classic of the genre. We are all intellectual children of Julian Simon. And so, it may be 40 years old, but if for nothing else, it's worth checking it out for the extraordinary insight that this person had, because he was a single individual fighting the entire world, and he got it right and the world got it wrong.
I'd agree with Marian's recommendation. I just add one more to that, and that would be Factfulness by Hans Rosling, this little short book that he published back in 2018. Anyway, it's this little brief book, and he goes through 10 biases that we have as human beings that prevent us from really understanding what the facts are telling us. So it's a nice little foundation, a quick read that gets people to reorient their perspective and think deeper about what reality is really telling us about the world.
And, since, maybe we are going long, but I might as well mention other authors who are very important to read. There is Deirdre McCloskey's Bourgeois Trilogy. There is Joel Mokier's of Athena and Culture of Growth. There is Johan Norberg's Open, an excellent book. Pretty much anything by Bjorn Lomborg. One of the things that makes me hopeful about the future is that, when people like Max Roser and Hans Rosling and I started pursuing this line of thought back in 2013 or 2012, we were it with Matt Ridley. Obviously, he's the granddaddy of it all. But now so many people are thinking along the same lines. So many people are pursuing this, are defending progress and explaining why, how we attained it and how it's possible to promote it and maintain it in the future, that I'm really quite optimistic. A lot of smart people are coming to our side, not just, intellectuals of heft, but also wealthy people who have their own followers, from Elon Musk to Mark Andreessen. We hope to get Peter Thiel on our side at some point.
Oh, and let me just also mention your book, 10 Global Trends Every Smart Person Should Know, that you did.
Co-author, I should have mentioned my co-author on that book, Ronald Bailey from Reason Magazine. Super smart guy. Again, his books are worth reading too. Wonderful.
Any new projects either of you want to mention?
Well, we actually get to come out with a couple things. We have a course, an 8-hour course that Jordan Peterson's Peterson Academy is going to do and hopefully go online here in the next couple of months, which gives people a chance to go deeper on these subjects with us. And we're hopeful that, once again, we kind of did this scholarly academic book, and we're hoping to try to come up with new iterations of it that give it more appeal and allow us to explain it to a general, broader, younger audience. So we're hoping to do that in the future.
That's a wonderful idea. This book was great, but I would love to be able to recommend a shorter version with fewer equations to friends.
Well, we do have a beginner's guide that Cato's going to publish too. That's going to be less than 100 pages.
Amazing.
A lot more pictures too. So maybe it'll be good.
I loved the graphs.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Marian, about new projects?
At this point, I'm still, to my massive surprise, I'm still involved in the promotion of the book. I have a lot of speaking engagements coming up. And the last 18 months or so have been quite extraordinary in terms of the public's reception of the book. So I'm going to hold off before committing to any big projects yet.
Oh, that's great. It's worth it. Keep promoting it. I'm so grateful you guys came on here. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm at the Cato Institute, CATO. It's a libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C. And I also am the founder and editor of humanprogress.org. So my emails and my phone numbers are both on the website, humanprogress.org, and also cato.org. And of course, we have a very beautiful website dedicated to the book called superabundance.com, where people can go and check out the book. They can find our email addresses there, superabundance.com.
Gale?
Yeah, same thing. Superabundance.com.
Beautiful. My guests once again have been Marian Tupy and Gale Pooley, and their book is Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet. Gale, Marian, thank you so much for joining me on Ideas Having Sex.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.